It begins in the quiet. A narrow path, tall trees, the kind of forest where light breaks slowly through leaves, and every sound feels closer than it should. You were small the first time you heard it. Maybe sitting on a bed. Maybe holding a book with worn pages. A voice told you about a little girl in a red hood walking alone through the woods. She wasn't afraid. She carried bread in a basket. Something warm, something meant to heal, and somewhere between the trees, a wolf was waiting. We are told this story early, before we know what fear truly is. Before we understand why some paths feel wrong even when they look beautiful. The girl walks. The forest listens. The wolf appears, not roaring, not violent, but calm, polite, curious. He asks where she is going, and she answers. That part always feels small, almost harmless. Just words. Just kindness. The wolf smiles. We know what happens next. The girl leaves the path. She is distracted by flowers, by color, by beauty. The forest grows quieter. The grandmother's house waits at the edge of the trees, small and fragile, like a promise that safety is near. But safety comes too late. The wolf arrives first. He wears a face that does not belong to him. He lies down in a bed that is not his. And when the girl finally enters, the world is already broken. Sometimes a hunter comes. Sometimes the wolf is cut open and the grandmother returns, alive as if nothing happened. Other times, in older tellings, there is no rescue. The girl is eaten. The story ends. We are told the lesson is simple. Do not talk to strangers. Do not wander from the path. Do not trust the dark. But even as children, something about this story feels heavier than a lesson. Why a wolf? Why not a monster with claws and horns? Why not something clearly evil? And why a forest? Why does danger always live between trees, far from homes and roads and voices? Most of all, why is this story so old? Stories meant only to scare children do not survive for centuries. They fade, they soften. They are forgotten, but this one stayed. It crossed borders, changed languages, shifted endings, and still the wolf waited. Still, the girl walked. Still, the forest stood in silence, watching fairy tales endure because they remember things for us. They carry fears we no longer know how to name. Warnings we stopped saying out loud long before books, before ink and paper. Stories were spoken at night. Near fiery light, they were not entertainment. They were survival. Parents told them with quiet urgency. Grandmothers repeated them slowly, their voices low. Not to frighten, but to prepare. Because once, long ago, the forest was real danger. Not a symbol, not a place of magic, but a boundary. Beyond it, the rules of the village ended. Beyond it, there were no witnesses. Wolves were not myths then. They followed camps. They watched from the dark. They learned us, and not every wolf walked on four legs. Some spoke. Some smiled. Some knew how to ask the right questions. This is why the story feels cruel. Because it was never meant to be gentle. It was shaped by people who knew that innocence alone could not protect you. That kindness, without caution, could lead you into shadows. Little Red Riding Hood was not born in a nursery. She was born in a world where forgetting the danger meant you did not come home. And maybe that is why. Even now, the story still makes our chest tighten. Why the forest still feels alive. Why the wolf's voice still echoes? Because somewhere beneath the soft pages and simple words, the old warning remains. And what if this tale is not about a girl at all, but about the moment humanity learned that the dark does not always look dark? Maybe that is why the story never ends. It keeps walking quietly. Right beside us, it began long before ink touched paper, before red cloaks, before happy endings. Before anyone thought this was a story for children, picture a fire at night. Not in a castle, but in the open wild. Faces lit by flame. Voices low. The forest breathing just beyond the light. This is where the story lived. First, not written, spoken, and in those early tellings, there was no rescue. No hunter, no second chance. The girl walked into the woods, and she did not return. The story ended there. That silence at the end was the point. Because in medieval Europe, stories were not meant to comfort. They were meant to warn. Parents told them with steady eyes. Grandmothers repeated them without softening the truth. If you left the path, if you trusted the wrong voice, the world would not save you. But even these dark versions were not the beginning. They were only echoes. The trail leads further back into older lands, older fears in ancient Greece. The wolf was never just an animal. It was a shape danger could wear. Young women were warned about men who smiled too easily, who spoke gently, who waited at the edge of safety. The forest in these stories was not magical. It was a line. On one side, the village. Names, rules, protection. On the other, nothing stepped beyond the trees, and the laws that kept you safe fell away. In these tales, wolves walked upright. They spoke. They blended in. They were hunger with a human face. Travel north, and the fear grows larger. In Norse lands, wolves were not just threats to people. They were threats to the world itself. Fenrir, the great wolf of prophecy, was bound by the gods because they feared him. They knew he would break free. They knew he would swallow the sun to them. The wolf was chaos. The end of order. The moment when everything familiar was torn apart. When the Norse spoke of wolves, they were speaking about the collapse of safety. The return of darkness. Go back even further. Before temples, before kings in prehistoric Europe. Wolves followed human camps. They watched from the edge of firelight. Their eyes caught the glow and held it. They were close enough to hear breathing, far enough to remain unseen. To early humans, wolves lived between worlds. They moved through night. They survived hunger. They took what they needed. They became symbols of desire, of survival at any cost, of the unknown waiting just beyond control, and always they stood at the edge. Across time and cultures, the shape of the story remains the same. A young figure. A path that leads away from safety. A predator that does not look like one. Sometimes it is a wolf. Sometimes it is a god. Sometimes it is a man. But the message does not change. This was never just a tale to pass the time. It was a map of fear, of boundaries, of what happens when you cross them unprepared. Each generation passed it on, changing the details but keeping the warning intact, because danger evolves. But it never disappears. The oldest echoes of Little Red Riding Hood are not about a girl in a cloak. They are about us, about how we learned to name the dark, about how we tried to teach the young where not to walk alone. And maybe that is why this story still feels alive, because the path is still there. The forest still waits, and somewhere, the old wolf is still listening. It begins at the edge of the trees. The light fades there. Not all at once, but slowly. As if the world is asking a question to ancient people, the forest was never just scenery. It was not a place you passed through without thought. It was a threshold, a test. You entered it as one thing and returned as another. If you returned at all for children, the forest marked the end of safety, the last place where parents' voices could reach you. Beyond that line, choices mattered. Mistakes stayed with you. That is why so many old stories begin there, because that is where life changed. The girl steps into the trees, and something ancient is already watching. The red hood she wears is not a pretty detail. It is a signal. Red was the color of blood, of life moving forward. Of the body changing. In many old cultures, red marked transformation. The moment when a child was no longer a child. When the world began to look different, sharper, more dangerous. The red hood tells us this story is not about innocence. It is about the loss of it. And then there is the wolf, not just teeth and fur. Not just an animal from the wild. The wolf is hunger. Not only for food, but for control. For closeness. For power, it speaks softly. It listens. It knows how to sound kind. This is the most important part. Because the oldest fears were never about monsters that announced themselves. They were about the ones that blended in. The wrong voice. The wrong guide. The presence that feels familiar but leads you away from the path in some of the earliest versions of the story. There is a moment too disturbing to soften. The girl eats her grandmother, not because the story wanted to shock, but because it needed to tell the truth. This act meant something once, something terrible and final. It was the breaking of innocence, the crossing of a line that could not be uncrossed, a moment when the old self disappears and something new takes its place. To ancient listeners, this was not fantasy. It was a warning. Once certain choices are made, you cannot return to who you were. The story does not judge her. It does not shout. It simply shows what happens. That is why these tales feel cold. Why they do not rush to comfort us. Why they leave us uneasy. They were not written to be kind. They were shaped to keep people alive. Parents told them so children would remember where danger waited. Grandmothers passed them on so the next generation would listen when instinct whispered. These stories taught survival in a world that did not forgive mistakes. They taught that the forest does not care who you are, that hunger wears many faces, that not every voice deserves trust, and maybe that is the hidden meaning beneath the tale. Little Red Riding Hood is not about fear. It is about awareness, about learning when to stop walking, when to stay on the path, when to question a smile, because the forest still exists, not always with trees, not always with wolves, but the test remains. And maybe that is why this story never fades. It begins with a feeling you cannot name. That moment when something seems wrong, but you keep walking anyway. The path is familiar. The voice sounds kind. And still, the air feels colder. Little Red Riding Hood is not about a girl lost in the woods. Not really. It is about the day humanity learned that danger does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers. For a long time, people believed threats would announce themselves. With claws. With shadows. With obvious signs. But the world taught us otherwise. The most dangerous things learned how to look safe. They learned how to smile. How to speak gently. How to wear the faces we trust. That truth did not come from books. It came from loss, from footsteps that never returned, from paths that led too far, from lessons learned too late. So we told stories. We softened them for children. We wrapped them in red cloth and talking animals. But beneath the surface, the warnings stayed sharp. For thousands of years, the story endured. It crossed borders, changed languages, traded blood for metaphor. The wolf lost some of his teeth. The girl gained a rescuer. The ending grew kinder. But the fear never vanished, because the forest never vanished. The forest is not just trees. It is any place where rules fade. Any moment where you are alone with a choice. It is the unknown between where you are and where you think you are going. And wolves still wait there. Not always as animals. Not always as strangers. Sometimes they are familiar. Sometimes they are welcomed. Sometimes they arrive with advice and concern. That is the truth hidden beneath the tale. Little Red Riding Hood is a story about learning to listen to the quiet voice inside you. The one that hesitates. The one that feels uneasy even when everything looks fine. It is about realizing that innocence alone is not enough to protect you. That kindness must walk beside awareness. That trust must be earned. Every generation tells this story again because every generation must learn the same lesson. Parents still warn. Children still wander. The world still tests us. And the story adapts because it has to. It changes clothes. It softens its words. But it never forgets what it was made for. It remembers the lives it was meant to save. Maybe that is why it still lives in us. Why the image of a quiet forest can make our chest tighten. Why a polite voice asking questions can feel more dangerous than a growl. The story survives because it is not finished. It walks beside us as we grow. As we leave safe places, as we learn where the path ends. And maybe the real secret of Little Red Riding Hood is not hidden in the past at all. Maybe it endures because the danger never left. It only learned how to hide. And somewhere, even now, the forest is listening.